For this section, I'm going to work with my cake watercolors, still keeping with that limited color palette. And for this one, I'll use paper, like the color of my actual paper, to create the tints that I'm working with. For this one, when you're working with cake watercolors, a mistake that sometimes people do is they use them, or they try to use them too dry. You really need to create a nice puddle in your cake to work with. And then you can use the color directly out of this cake, or you can have like a paper, not a paper plate, like a wax paper plate that has a coating, or styrofoam, or even like some tinfoil or something to use as a palette. And I'm just going to draw some of this pigment over and apply it to this palette so that I've got it to work with. This is how I'd want to color mix, because I don't really want to add new colors to the cake of watercolor itself, to where it would, you know, make that maybe hard to use by itself. Okay, so I've added some of that, and then if I want to turn one of them into that more true blue, I'm just going to add a touch, not much. It's a very, very light-handed touch of the magenta, because I'm not looking for it to turn purple, which I'm actually achieving. I'm looking for it to turn blue, so that's a little better when I stirred all of that together. This one, these aren't going to be perfect because this is a little bit more like teal than the tube, but it gives me another variety. And then I've got my black to work with as well that I can add over here in a couple places to create some different tints, tones, and shades. And then I'm just going to start working with these colors. All right, I'm going to start off by, I'd like to make a shade, so I'm just going to stir some of this cyan into some black, and I'm going to start painting in my section, outlining first where I can, and then just drawing the pigment away from that object. It's much easier to work that way, to draw the pigment away from something than it can be to paint up to it. So I like to just sort of go along that edge and then pull the paint away to fill in whatever area it is that I am working with. And then I'm going to, anytime I want to make a color change, like maybe because this is going to be a pretty large area here, maybe I don't want to stick with this same color for this whole space. Maybe I want to shift. With these, you can easily just pick up your next color that you're shifting to and go ahead and start painting with it. And where those two colors touch each other, because it is watercolor and wet will bleed into wet, I can just paint them next to each other, and it pretty naturally shifts from one to the other without me needing to do a whole lot about it. And I'm just going to work on painting this area in. The more water I add, the lighter my color will become. So I'll work on transitioning this one even lighter as I work my way across my paper by just continuing to add water, but adding no more paint. So every time I'm just dipping my brush in some water, I'm stirring a little bit more water into that paint that I've got on my palette, and it will shift lighter and lighter because more of that white of my paper is able to show through. The more water I add, the lighter it becomes. I can even get to a point where I'm just working with water and the pigment that is touching that water, and it'll draw some of it to finish filling in this area, and it'll become very, very light because of that less pigment, less color, and more water. I'm never pressing very hard with my brush. I'm allowing just the tip of my brush to be used. A lot of people get concerned with using a large brush in small spaces, but I mean the tip of it is actually fairly small, and as long as I don't press very hard with the tip of that brush, I can get into pretty small areas by just pointing at them with just the tip of the brush and only allowing the tip of the brush to touch the paper. All right, I'm going to start working this into more of this true cyan that came out of just the cake by itself, and I can transition down here to being a pretty vibrant version of this by starting to add more pigment and less water, but here I want it to transition smoothly. So I stuck with using more water. But then as I continue to dip into my paint, I will stir it around a little bit more and a little bit more until I get to that really vibrant cyan. And I can just dab a little water here where these two are touching each other to allow them to do that more smooth transition. And I'm just gonna, again, I'm gonna hunt out all of my negative space here. I'm gonna pay attention to anywhere where there's like a hole in a leaf so that it gets included. And I'm gonna paint all of my negative space with my monochromatic blues. All right, so I've finished painting up my negative spaces in this composition. I'm going to allow them to dry before I move into, oh, I missed one, any positive space so that I don't end up with any of the unintentional bleeds that I want to avoid. And there was a couple negative spaces that were hard to spot, like in here. I really had to follow along the edge of my leaf to make sure I knew what was positive space and what was negative space, the way these two are interacting. But I think I caught all of them. I'll allow this to dry and then I will come back and work on that positive space. To keep with that yellow to orange analogous scheme, I'm only going to just use these two cakes. I'm probably going to mostly avoid using black because black and orange and yellow don't play super well like together. The black's just kind of too powerful and it ends up really muddying up those colors. I may create a little bit of a shade of one of them, but it's very hard to control making that look nice. So I went ahead and created a nice puddle in my cake here, and then I dumped that puddle onto a mixing tray so that I had some to work with. Here I have the individual cake that I can work with for just plain yellow, but now I've got all these sections that I can work with to vary that some. And then I did the same thing with my magenta just to create a little bit of variety in shades. So I've got my plain yellows and then I've mixed some yellow and magenta here to get more of a yellow orange. I used only just a little bit of magenta and quite a lot of that yellow. I've got more magenta here and I'm going to use enough yellow to where I can create hopefully a more true orange between those two. And then I can create in this section here a more red orange by using more magenta and less of the yellow. And then by varying the amount of water I use to paint with, I'm going to end up creating just different tints of yellow mostly, and then just more saturated. I did clean my water. It's kind of orange now from mixing this up, but I did clean it after using the blue so that I wouldn't muddy up my paint just by contaminating it with the water. All right, I'm going to start just painting with these on to this section, and by changing the amount of water, this little drip of blue is going to end up mixing in, but that's just a little happy accident. That's not that big of a deal. By varying the amount of water I'm using, I'm going to create more saturated colors and less saturated colors. The more pigment I use and the less water I use, the same as in my background or my negative space, I'll end up with more saturated color, which just is a way of saying like more vibrant color, whereas the more water I use with my pigment, the lighter it's going to become. It's allowing more of the paper to show through the color so that it ends up being a lighter version or a tint of that color. Now hopefully you can see, just because of how light this color is, if I were to come and try to add black, it would be very hard to control adding a nice amount of black to where it still is a color that looks nice. Okay, and I'm just going to come across painting with these different pigments that I created by mixing my colors together, filling in my sections, varying my amount of water so that I can get different tints of the colors that I created. I'll go ahead and add black in a section so you can kind of see what that looks like. I'm gonna just use my plain yellow, and I'll go for this leaf right here. I'm gonna paint, first of all, plain yellow in to this area. And while it is still wet, I'm gonna mix right on my leaf a little bit of black in. Finish the yellow first though. Okay. And I'm gonna grab a little bit of this black. I've not activated it yet. I didn't get much of black on here at all, just a little bit. And I'm gonna start stirring that in, and you can see just how quickly it changes that yellow. It's a tone, or not a tone, it's a shade of yellow. I'm adding black, but that black overpowers the yellow so fast because it's just, it's a darker value color. It's a more powerful color than that yellow is. So as I stir it around in here, it's just changing the yellow very, very quickly, and I'm only using just the tiniest little bit of it. So if you choose to work with a lighter color and you're using black, be mindful of that as you're working so that you don't just overpower and end up with something that is not what you want. You know, use little bits. You can always add more, but you can't take it away as easily. I mean, you can, but not as easily. All right, so I'm gonna grab some of this plain yellow again, and I'm gonna paint in this section and show you another thing that you can do. So I've mixed colors together on this palette. I don't have to do all my color mixing on the palette though. I can mix directly, like I did with the black, directly onto my painting. I'm gonna grab some just straight magenta, and I'm not really gonna stir it around. I'm just gonna add some little dots of it onto this leaf, and then I'm just gonna leave it. I'm gonna allow that to dry and just find out what the resulting texture is. And I think I'll treat all of the leaves on this little, that go together from this plant, the same way, and allow that texture of that natural bleed of the watercolor to just occur and see what it looks like. So I've finished painting in all of these areas, and I'm going to allow them to dry so then I can see what it looks like, and just varied the different amounts of water and the amounts of paint that I was using. You can see, like in this section, I added black to orange, and it really does turn brown. So if that's what you're looking for, that would be a nice way of achieving it.